Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger of bloggingforjobs.com, for a 45-minute in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, here's your host, Jessica, with this episode of Workology.
Influence. Everyone wants it and seldom have it. It's a subject of a lot of conversation in the human resources and recruiting space. It's something you work for, and I'm here with this podcast episode guest to help you, if you so desire, become a thought leader. We will break down exactly what it means to be a thought leader and how to get there. Welcome to the Workology podcast. It's great to have you on this podcast as part of the Blogging for Jobs family. My guest today is Denise Brosseau. Denise is a CEO of Thought Leadership Lab, a boutique professional services firm which specializes in building leaders into thought leaders and increasing their discoverability, amplifying their social influence, and catalyzing strategic connections that lead to a seat at the table for conversations that matter. Welcome, Denise.
Thank you. So nice to be here, Jessica.
Tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Well, I guess at heart, I would say I'm an entrepreneur. I began my first company when I was 26 years old, but I also spent time in a lot of different worlds. I spent some time in the technology industry as a marketing exec and running product teams. I spent some time, I founded and ran a trade association and a venture conference working with women entrepreneurs. I started a women's leadership company, really helping scale the impact and influence of women executives. And then about 6 or 8 years ago, I started my present work. And as you mentioned, really working on this idea of how do we get to the table? How do we build our influence, amplify our impact, leave a legacy that matters? And my work is so varied and interesting now as a speaker, a coach, a consultant, and an author in this space. And that is this idea of thought leadership and building influence is really my sweet spot.
Well, I mentioned that today's topic is how to be an influencer. First, I wanted to ask you, can you kind of define for us what an influencer is?
Well, I think we could spend some real time on this, but let me see if I can kind of crystallize it. I think about influencers are people who can move people to adopt new ideas, people who can get us to move and adopting a new behavior, being in action in a new direction, adopting change. So I think of influencers often as change makers. They have their own actions and ideas that we can model ourselves after, but also they galvanize us to move in a new direction. What do you think? Is that kind of your definition, or where would you argue with me?
I agree with you. I think that they're in the HR and recruitment space, especially among the HR thought leaders, there's a lot of conversations around online and social media activity, but you don't necessarily need to be an influencer within your industry to be influential at your company, or as you're talking about different organizations that you're a part of or movements that you're creating.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's fun about this idea of being an influencer is that sometimes we're an influencer in our community. Like we need a stop sign on our corner. That might be something we really get in action around. It might be something we really care about, child trafficking or whatever. And a third might be something in our specific niche, our area of expertise at work. So the good news is we can have influence in lots of both multiple places, but also individually in different arenas.
I think that's an important point to make. It doesn't need to be all or nothing. You can be influential at your local charity and maybe influential in your work, but maybe not necessarily wanting to be an influencer in maybe your neighborhood community or something like that.
I love this story. There's a gentleman in Southern California. He calls himself the gangsta gardener. And, here's a guy who's an artist, and he ends up starting a movement around urban gardens by planting a garden in his front yard on a piece of property that actually wasn't his property. It was, a strip of land owned by the city. And they turned to him pretty quickly and said, hey, you can't put a garden there. And he galvanized tons of people to sign a petition and created an entire movement in his community to say, wait a minute, it can't just all be strip malls. We need fresh food. And what if we could take the empty lot over here or the parking lot here and actually put in gardens? And he started doing that in South Central and then started moving that through TED Talks and a variety of other models as a thought leader to get others in other communities to adopt his idea. Now, he still has his full-time job as an artist, but this is his movement he's creating because it matters to him and it matters to his community and the kids in his community. I thought that was a really powerful story.
Well, it's interesting because you're talking about motivation, right? And so it's not always like fame and fortune or a promotion. There are people who can be influential in different places without having it be their full-time job.
Absolutely. And it certainly began that way for me and for many others.
Well, you're a woman of influence yourself. Silicon Valley Business Journal recognized you as a top 100 woman of influence. So how does one become a thought leader or influential?
I always like to tell the story about my own journey because I think of myself as an accidental thought leader. I mentioned earlier that I started this work with women entrepreneurs. When I first began, it was the last time there was a real craze in women's entrepreneurship, sort of 1998, 1999, 2000. And I was running this trade association for high growth women-led businesses and started this venture conference for women to get in front of communities of investors and pitch their ideas. And it was the hot topic. It was I became this it girl on this topic because I was actually in action around making change in this arena, growing my organization to other cities. And I started getting press calls and invites to speak. And could I write a book and all of these different things? But this was not my plan. My plan was to grow my organization. I easily could have just put my head down and done the job in front of me. But I was really called by a deeper passion around this idea of women's access to capital and this knowledge that I had on this arena that not many people had. So I think one way to become this influencer is by accident and because you're in the right sweet spot in a growth area where it's sort of the trend. And another, I think, is that people can also become intentional thought leaders. They understand this idea of building a platform in order to gain traction or gain followership for their ideas. And so my work now is really around how do you have a strategy for this? It could be, as you said, could be for your career, that career insurance, as I call it, or it could be around a movement or an idea. So I think that there's different paths to get there. And for me, it was more accidental, but now as I've thought through it and worked with others and really documented the process, now I realize, wow, you can be intentional about this. What an idea. I wish I'd known that when I was younger.
Have you ever thought about writing a blog post, maybe you already have, about the accidental thought leader? I love that title, by the way.
Oh, no, I think I should. Thank you for the idea.
Yeah, that's what I do, right? So I like the idea of accidental thought leader, and that's probably why when I heard you speak in San Jose, it resonated with me so much because I'm also accidental, and I built this blog and this community and a conversation, and my intention wasn't to have a podcast or have a book or do any of those things. It just kind of flowed. But I think that there is something to be said about people who recognize those accidental opportunities and turn them into something more.
Absolutely. And define those trend lines. So part of this I talk about for my clients is you're going to work a lot faster if you can align to the things that are already happening in your industry or your community or the movement you're trying to create. Let's just try to get in the slipstream here and move more quickly. But it doesn't mean all of us have it all figured out, the 5-year plan, the 10-year plan, but instead to take those opportunities as you did to leap in and make a difference. And I think if we come from that place, if we come from that genuine commitment and passion around a cause or an idea or our community or a desire to bring community together, I think that's when we really shine, and it's not artificial or something that's all about making money or whatever. That to me is not thought leadership.
So in your book, Ready to be a Thought Leader, you mention a 7-step process. Can you elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Sure. Let me see if I can give the little short version here. So this 7 steps, I could spend 20 hours on each one, and I will not do that, I promise. But, I think about step one as what I call find your driving passion. So, as we've been talking a lot about, where do your interests and your expertise and your credibility and your commitment align? I call that the thought leadership intersection point. Like where's that space in the middle? And if you begin there and then you start to craft this possible future, I call it the what if future. What if, in my world, it was what if more women had access to venture capital? And that was the work of my nonprofit, but it was also the work of that was my cause that I was passionate about. So figuring out that what if future for yourself, a possible future that you're committed to bring about. That's all sort of in step one. And that gets into that trends and there's some specific exercises you can do to help you figure that out. The second, I think, is what I call the build your ripples of influence. So this is getting out and testing your ideas and your opinions with some knowledgeable stakeholders so that you're trying to gather input and refine your thinking. This is a sense, for example, when we started this group, the Forum for Women Entrepreneurs, we were testing how do we move this cause forward? How do we gain more access to capital for women entrepreneurs? There was actually 100 different paths we could have taken. So we were testing a variety of different quote unquote business models or different directions that we could take. You need to be doing that in that second step. In order to build ripples of influence, you can't do that if you get, there's either 1,000 people already going in that direction and you're getting drowned out, or there's no one moving in your direction and no one's paying attention. You want to try to find some things you can do that are going to give you that traction. And then this third step is activate your advocates. So this is all about how do you attract supporters? How do you get well-connected advocates who can champion your ideas? So this could be a product, a program, an initiative, an idea, a change you're trying to bring about, but you can't be everywhere. So it's this idea of really where can the broader audiences be reached by activating the people who support you. So finding those early supporters, gaining buy-in. Step 4, which I will admit was not in the initial proposal to do the book, was what I call put your I, as in the letter I, on the line. And when I say it wasn't in the initial book proposal, I realized over time as I talked to more and more thought leaders that this is the piece where most of us get stuck, overcoming those inner voices, as one of my clients calls it, the itty bitty shitty committee that shows up in our head that says, you can't do this. Who are you to be the one? Nobody's going to listen to you, or this has all been said. So there's a whole chapter and a whole process we need to go through to get out of our own way. Often in this step, there's so many reasons not to: family, cultural, your boss, your company, your industry, whatever that holds you back. But this is the step about getting forward. Then step 5, codify your lessons learned. How do you create a replicable model so others can be inspired and empowered to expand on what you've done? Number 6, which I think a lot of people are already starting with, even very early, putting yourself on shout. How do you get the word out about what you've learned, your efforts, your activities? Be discoverable, as we talked about earlier. Connect with those who can build on your ideas. And then the last I call incite evolution and revolution. So this is idea of where's the traction happening? How are you building a community of followers? Who's going to carry forward your efforts beyond you? And really also there's a section in there about auditing your progress. How do you know you're making any progress? Are you focusing on the right activities in order to galvanize others around your ideas? So that's the 7 steps. And people jump in at different stages. Some people start with the put yourself on shout and move back and realize they need some of those other steps. So I encourage people in the book to, take wherever you need to be and step into that first.
I like the idea of just being intentional about this in general, right? And having a plan, because it helps you really formulate in your mind where the end game is, and you have an idea of maybe what it's like to get there, and then you can kind of build from there a plan, who you're bringing along with you, what folks you're going to, network in and build those relationships, and then the different platforms or places that you're going to shout out and build those relationships so you can grow your movement.
Yeah, because some people do start with a blog like you did, and some people realize, okay, I'm not ready to get out and talk about my ideas yet. I need to test them. So maybe I need small groups of people, even at just one-on-one conversations before I'm bold enough to put my ideas out more broadly, figuring out what resonates. So it's everybody comes at this a little differently, but from all the people I've worked with and all the people that I've met and interviewed for my book and others, these steps are almost invariably part of the puzzle here and may not be always in the same order, but they're pretty critical.
Is there one step that you think is more important than any of the others, or other people maybe view more important?
Only one. You're only going to give me one. All right, let me see. I think that number one, and that's probably why it's number one, is that driving passion. We've spoken a little bit about it up till now, that this idea that thought leadership takes time. If you're not committed to moving some change forward, or you're not excited and passionate about something that you're working in, the likelihood of you making any big impact is small. I don't think there's enough money on the planet for someone to get paid to stick to something in order to become a thought leader in it. Maybe I'm wrong, but this idea that really that passion is critical. And then if I could add a second piece of it, it's that being able to overcome our fears and doubts, to get out of our own way. And every audience, every group, every individual I've talked to, people get really stuck. There's just so many negative voices and thoughts and processes that we go through that hold us back. It's very unfortunate. So without that, I think you can have all the passion in the world, but if your fears get in the way, it's hard to move forward.
I agree with you about the fear, and it's a funny thing. Sometimes you don't even realize it's a fear until you're knee deep in it, or you're faced with the situation. I have been pretty open about the fact that I didn't necessarily sign up for this opportunity, but I am enjoying it, and I am loving the platform and the conversations and the learning and just the lives that we're changing. And I also didn't think about the visibility that it brings you, and sometimes the criticism, because when you put yourself out there, I didn't think, people would not agree with what I was saying. And so I have had to learn to be okay with people not agreeing with my point of view and developing thick skin when the critics are out there.
That's a really critical one, and a common one, sadly. I think if you are visible, people will take the pot shots. It's an easy thing to do. And the other one I think that stops us is often a level that keeps rising of perfection. So for me, I talk a lot about getting my first book contract and being so excited until I was terrified. Like, those things were very tied. I was excited and I was terrified. Can I write a book? Is this possible? Is this book ever going to be good enough to put out there? And so I got really stuck in my head for several weeks. And I love to tell that, honestly, I sat down and I rewatched every episode of The West Wing instead of working on the book, even though I had a book contract. And I'd already seen these silly episodes. Like, what was the point of that? But we all get stuck in our own place, in our own way. It could be a stinging criticism. It could be a bar in our own minds that keeps going up. It could be family members or your boss. And so finding other allies, and for me it was two women who've written a number of books who kind of kicked me in the butt and really helped me with lots of strategies and ideas to move forward. And just being willing for me to admit to them that I was stuck was the first thing I had to overcome. And after that it moved more quickly, don't you think? Is telling people I'm stuck.
Recognizing that fear and being able to admit it is huge. And I will say, when I got my copy of my book, like, they sent it to me in the mail, that's when it got real for me. And then I started thinking, oh my gosh, what if people don't like this? But it's already too late. It's printed. It's ready to go.
I guess I was a little faster, and my fear quotient came more quickly. I like that you got the book done before you went there.
Maybe I was just more naive.
I don't know. Who knows? But fear is unquantifiable until you're in the middle of it, and then it feels overwhelming. We need help from others.
We do, and that starts with a really good team of supporters, friends, and mentors.
Mm-hmm. No question.
Well, I shared with you a little bit about the HR industry and the recruiting industry, and kind of some articles around thought leadership. Those articles will be included within Blogging for Jobs. Just go to the podcast section and we'll have all those links for you, including the link to Denise's book, Ready to be a Thought Leader and some other resources that she's shared. I think that sometimes people often associate, at least in human resources, that a thought leader has to be a blogger, which is sometimes common, and someone who is active on social media and speaking at conferences. It's not something that everyone can do. I mean, in fact, blogging, as you know, you'll write a lot and have a blog. It takes a lot of work. And sometimes it's not necessarily that's something that you're able to do because of your current employment situation or, the time management thing. What are some ways that you can be a thought leader without maybe writing a bunch or traveling extensively?
I love this conversation. My first client that I ever worked with to become a thought leader was in the HR space. And she worked for a large company here in the Bay Area that did not allow her to do social media, did not allow her to blog. So I think it's really an important part of the dialogue. So what did she do? And this is I'd like to talk about three quick strategies. First one is idea of being a convener, which is what she did. So she was the head of workforce development for her company, and she convened all the other heads of workforce development in sister companies that were all in her same industry, and put that group together in a way that they all shared best practices. She was able to find an audience for her best practices that she was doing in her company, but also learn from the others. And then together they could work more actively to make change happen. That's one strategy. And she did not set herself up as the chair because she was new in her industry. She invited someone else with more prestige to be that chair. But this being the co-chair and the person who put the agenda together, and the person who was mostly the one presenting, helped her to really galvanize both thought leadership name for herself, but also change to happen. So convener, I think, is one strategy. Second, I think, is this idea of being an amplifier. So an amplifier is somebody who takes the ideas of others and amplifies them. And so finding what are the best ideas in your field, listening in on a podcast or reading or attending a conference once a year, and then bringing those ideas back and sharing them, sharing those that expertise you've gained. That's another model that you don't have to do a lot of traveling and it doesn't have to be social media. And then I think the third is to be a curator. So the curator is somebody who is really sussing out the best information for their team, for their division, and maybe putting out an internal newsletter or hosting a brown bag lunch. So the idea is to share best practices, to create a community of people together who care about the same things you care about. That's all thought leadership. And this idea of also potentially helping others become thought leaders is another step that HR leaders can take. And so all of those, I think, are models that are not about becoming active on social media or blogging.
So it could be something like starting a book club or maybe hosting a meetup or a cocktail hour or simply just being that person that shares like a monthly email with your favorite links or resources that you've gathered.
Yeah, absolutely. And invite in people like that have a great book to come from your area who specializes in your niche and bring that person to your company. Often, if they've just come out with a book, they're willing to come for free. So that's another opportunity.
I love it. And they're simple. So it doesn't involve traveling and packing and going halfway across the US or having to, if maybe you don't like speaking in front of a large group of people, worrying about, that sort of situation. You're still sharing, you're still growing, you're still building a reputation and helping others.
No question.
Well, let's take a little bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic is how to be a thought leader. We're learning all about thought leadership, influencer, how to build a strategy to go out there and position yourself as someone who is aware of trends, information. They're an amplifier, they're a curator. And my guest today is Denise Brosseau. You can connect with her on Twitter, and her Twitter is @ThoughtLeaderLab, L-A-B. Now tell us, how important is leadership for thought leaders?
The truth is that leadership and thought leadership are interrelated, but you can be a thought leader without being a leader and vice versa. I've seen both. Being both and is what I call the truly winning strategy. But I look at leadership as I learned this model from Dr. Frank Green, who was one of my mentors. He's passed on now, but he shared with me a model that he developed. Leadership in his mind was three things: VRE, vision, relationships, and execution. Most of us start our career in execution. We're the doers. Whatever we've been hired to do, that's our job. Over time, we realize that to get things done, we're far more effective if we can build relationships and get others to take a piece of what we're doing, or work more effectively together in teams or across our division or industry. Third, I think, is the piece of vision. And this is the critical component that really is looking to the future and helping a team of people or a group move forward. Once you get into that realm, I think that's where that piece of it is really tied to thought leadership, because thought leadership is often about that future. What's the future we're bringing about? What's our piece in bringing that future about? And once we start talking about that vision and the efforts, the execution and the relationships, talking about the best practices we've developed, the ideas, the learnings that we've done as a leader, that's when we can be most effective as thought leaders. So they're intertwined, but I have honestly seen thought leaders that you would not say are leaders, and vice versa. And so I like the focusing on the best of both and trying to do both in your life. But the truth is, you won't necessarily be both.
I was interested in if they could be separate. My thought was that it was likely, but I really like your three areas here. I think those are really key. And as I think about my career, I think where I'm kind of standing right now, and I definitely relationships, and then that execution piece when you're younger, early on in your career, you're doing, and that's how you establish yourself, gain promotion, climb that ladder. Execution's still important, but it's more about the team and the people that you bring on board to help you make those things happen.
There's a wonderful article, it's a Harvard Business Review article, Herminia Ibarra wrote a few years ago, and it's called Women and the Vision Thing. So for the women on this, listening to this podcast, I think this, unfortunately, when she studied leadership traits, men and women, that women often hold themselves back from this vision piece. And that's the one area that we have to really work to develop. And she's got a lot of good strategies in her article that you could find online. So Herminia is Ibarra, Ibarra. I recommend it for people who are thinking about that. How can I be better at vision? And how can I develop that characteristic of myself? Because it isn't something that I think they teach you in college. I don't know about you, but Jessica, they didn't teach me how to do that.
No, my degree's in anthropology, so in business. So I didn't really, I thought I was going to be a PhD candidate. I didn't think this was anything that I was going to be doing. So.
And I was Russian studies, so here we are.
Here we are, liberal arts, yay. So you mentioned the Harvard Business Review article. If you just go to bloggingforjobs.com and go ahead and put Thought Leadership Podcast, because Denise's last name is a little bit hard to spell. So just put Thought Leadership Podcast in, and we will be able to get you all the resources. One of the resources that I will also include in here is an excerpt of your book, Denise, from Forbes. It's a great article, and it talks about great leadership and the different types of leaders. And one thing that really resonated me was telling stories. Can you talk about maybe why telling stories is important in being a thought leader?
This is something I've really developed an understanding of over time. As a history major, which, Russian studies was a lot about studying history, that I always thought facts and data, that's what we need to learn. But the truth is, it's the stories that we remember. We see ourselves in stories. And thought leadership, I think, is about helping people see a new future and a new possibility. And stories help us to do that. The other thing I learned from talking to someone that I interviewed for my book, she said something that was so profound to me. She said, as she's telling stories, she relearns her own lessons, her own life lessons. So as we tell our stories to others, we can start to internalize those lessons that we've learned. It's sort of a win-win for the storyteller and the person listening to the story. I'm a junkie for stories. I listen to the Moth podcast all the time, and I'm always going to storytelling workshops and anything I can to become a better storyteller. I do think it's the critical component that can differentiate you an ability to draw people in quickly, an ability to bring people along with you, and an ability for people to remember what you say after you're gone. What do you think?
I agree with you. And one of the things that I also like about the article and what you mentioned here is about making complex things like less complex through the telling of stories, because people can relate to that story. I like to find weird points of view to things, like a simple task that somehow kind of the idea or the process relates to something that's larger, that's kind of confusing, and explaining it through. And that really resonates with people, and they can understand and then hopefully accept if it's a change, or if I'm trying to describe maybe a new way of thinking. They just relate to it a lot better.
One of the gentlemen I interviewed for my book, a great blogger, and he talks about the importance as a thought leader of being someone who can uncomplexify. And obviously it's a made up word, but I love that word because you're right. We have to uncomplexify, and stories help us to do that. And powerful metaphors is another place to really. Robin Chase of Zipcar talked to me a lot about this idea of the powerful metaphor and how can we use metaphors to help people grasp big ideas.
One of my favorite kind of examples for me was I was on this analyst webinar with a bunch of HR technology analysts, and we're talking about big data, and they're very high level talking about data and strategies and all this crazy stuff that for, I think, the average practitioner in the space and my readership and folks who are just getting started in big data, it was extremely confusing and overwhelming. And I kind of stopped the webinar and I said, look, big data is just like my master bedroom closet. It is a disaster, and I don't know where to start. And I said, I had to bring in the experts to help me organize and understand and build a master bedroom closet that worked for me. And a lot of people that they were like, oh my gosh, I love that. But the analysts were like, what are you doing? But that's what sometimes works for people.
It is so what works for people. And that to me is the last sentence, what you said is also very telling, that the real deep experts often lose touch with what thought leadership is about. That this thought leadership is not about showing how smart we are or how deep an expertise. It is really about making other people smarter. So this idea of using these powerful metaphors and simple metaphors like the master bedroom closet, that is distilling the best information in a way that others are going to remember it. The deep expertise people often, they don't know how to do that translation anymore because they're so deep in their subject matter. And that is when they lose their effectiveness, in my mind.
In the HR industry, there's a lot of debate among leaders that in order to be a thought leader, you have to be a practitioner. And when I mean practitioner, I mean someone who has a background of doing a corporate or recruiting job. So they've been in the trenches, they've done the job. I wanted to ask you, is there only one path to be a thought leader? And how can a vendor or a service provider in an industry that maybe services, human resources, recruiting, or some other, how can they be seen as a thought leader in that particular space?
I understand both points of view, and I have a broader definition. I absolutely agree that people who are practitioners can be very effective because thought leadership is often about sharing our best practices and how to do things. But the gift of being a service provider, and now that I am one and I'm on the other side of the table and not in corporate anymore, is that we have a much broader perspective in that I work with lots of different people from lots of different industries. And part of thought leadership is taking the best ideas from one place and helping those ideas to be fertilized in a new arena. So if you think about your service providers, they can take a much broader view, have the best practices across an industry or multiple industries that allow us to move forward more quickly. So if I go back to my client that I mentioned in the HR industry, she was new to her company. She took an idea that she had learned when she was on maternity leave, serving on a community board, and learned about a best practice in workforce in the biotech industry. And she brought that in to her own industry. That cross fertilization is critical. Service providers and vendors can often be those folks. Secondly, they're usually, if you're going to spend your whole career as a service provider in a space or a vendor, you're often very knowledgeable about a future that needs to happen. It is about bringing about change in the best possible way. I find that these folks can have that what if future even more clearly. Often we get very stuck when we're in corporate with whatever's right in front of us in our to-do list. And this idea of having that broader industry perspective, or potentially regulations that need to change, or new practices that need to be adopted, that I see that often more clearly on the vendor and service provider side. So it's a plus and not an either or. Have you found that to be true?
I agree with you, and I think that I have a lot more time than I did before, maybe an interest in even broadening my horizons, just even having a conversation with you today. 5 years ago when I was in corporate, I don't know if I would have picked up the phone and said, hey, let's talk some more. And that comes with experience, and maybe also getting out there and being more comfortable and having conversations with different people so you can learn and grow and then share with others.
And we can only encourage those who do have that long to-do list to recognize that this idea of broadening our network and broadening the kinds of people that we interact with makes us better leaders and makes us much better innovators, because all the good ideas are not in your organization, your team, and your company. You need to be out doing that cross-fertilization and cross-pollination with others in order to bring the best ideas and bring new changes and best practices to your group. That makes you a much more effective leader and thought leader.
And those of us who are out there gaining those experience and having those conversations, they are spending the time and effort and to build these relationships, have these conversations, to share with different folks in different places. So also, I'll also say that I think that my interpretation or my vision of who influences me and who I view a thought leader has changed over time. And so maybe before I was focused on a certain group of individuals, I'm thinking more about thought leadership in terms of CEOs, leaders in the workplace space for me, analysts, people that might have been different just even 24 months ago.
Absolutely. And that is that whole idea of that ripples of influence and activating your advocates. These are all people that we need in our milieu. And we are far more likely to understand that once we get out of corporate. But actually, in some ways, that's unfortunate, because in corporate, you can be far more effective if you do have that Rolodex at your fingertips.
Great. Well, let's talk about where people can go to find out more about you.
I have a website with a ton of resources. Thoughtleadershiplab.com is the best place. And people can also find me on LinkedIn, Denise Brosseau, Brosseau. I have some great pages full of resources on my website, and a manifesto. I have a thought leadership manifesto. So I hope people will get on there and check it out, join my mailing list, and even check out my upcoming boot camp. There's lots of information that I like to share with people. And I do have a blog, although I'm not as active as you are, so maybe I can learn a few things from you.
Well, we'll link to Denise's LinkedIn and get you all the links that you need. But thank you so much to Denise for joining us on the podcast. I very much appreciate you taking the time to be here. I also thank you for those that are listening here. This is the Workology podcast, hosted by Jessica Miller-Merrill, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, HR, and recruitment. Until next time, you can visit Blogging for Jobs to listen to all our past episodes, and we'll see you soon.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by Total Picture Media.